I am thrilled to be here with Cass Sunstein, one of the world's greatest and most influential thinkers across not just one domain, but law, economics, politics, the practice of public policy. I could go on. Many of you will know Cass as co-author of the highly influential seminal book on applied behavioral science called Nudge. But if you look at his Wikipedia page, you'll see that he's written so many dozens of wonderful books that they're grouped by decade. So we could talk about just about anything today. He's written on feminism, he's written on free trade, he's written on science fiction. But today we're going to talk about the way that governments and businesses are beginning to embrace behavioral science, perhaps more than beginning, and what it is that they're trying to achieve with that embracing of behavioral science. And I guess I would love to start by asking you, how did you get involved in thinking about behavioral science?
Well, thank you for that question. And I was at the University of Chicago as a kind of kid law professor. And at Chicago, the orthodoxy was that people are rational and they respond to incentives. And when you looked at these people who were proclaiming this view, they were exceptionally intelligent, but they also were on the tennis court occasionally erratic and hitting balls that they had no business hitting because that was not the rational shot to hit, or they were complaining about their investments where they had blundered, or maybe they were having divorces and saying they'd made some terrible mistakes in their lives. So they didn't seem completely rational. And I regarded their claims about human rationality with skepticism. It was kind of clueless skepticism. I was an English major, and so I didn't.
English major?
Yeah, I was an English major. So I guess knowing about Dickens and Shakespeare, you would be a little bit cautious about the idea that people are rational actors. But Shakespeare and Dickens didn't exactly give you a framework. But I discovered some work in psychology and behavioral economics, basically 5 or 7 years into teaching law. And it struck me like a thunderbolt, like a kind of explosion of illumination. And as soon as I saw that, where there was some systematizing of how people go wrong, I thought there's not only psychology and economics in here, there's stuff for law and public policy to get hold of. And that kind of explosion is something that I keep hearing. It's a happy explosion, and it's oriented much of my work since then.
And the subtitle of your book, Nudge, was Improving Decisions about Health, Wealth and Happiness. Is that still what you see as the goal of applied behavioral science?
Yeah, I think those three are probably at the top of any list. You might want to put happiness first. It's a little more unruly subtitle if the 3-syllable one is first, but absolutely. So if you think about people going about their daily lives, or about businesses trying to help their workers, which is usually good for business, or doctors trying to be good with their patients and incline them to take better care of themselves, or governments trying to make sure that the health system's working, or that economic growth is accelerating. It's a good trilogy.
So you would now put happiness first. Why is that?
I think so. Well, health is extremely important, and of course, and longevity is especially desirable. But if someone has a health condition which is a problem, the effect of that condition, as your work shows, on their well-being depends on where their mind's going. Right. And so you can have a terrific life even if your left leg doesn't work so good. You can have a terrific life even if you have to use a wheelchair. Yeah. And the premium put on health is important because it determines what people can be and do. But so much of one's reaction to health conditions, or to wealth, by the way, is a reflection of how your attention works. So wealth is important in the sense that, especially if you have economic deprivation, you're going to struggle with a lot of stuff. But the extent of your struggle depends on your mind. And there, I think the spotlight is rightly typically put on happiness or well-being.
Yeah, well-being is actually, I tend to use the word well-being, perhaps even more than happiness, because happiness is one of those strange things when you try to aim directly at it. You start to think, well, what am I defining as happiness here? There are all sorts of components that go into happiness that are actually almost easier to target.
You're completely right. There's some terrific work in social science on states that are essentially byproducts, that's the term.
Yeah.
And you know, if you try to aim at sleep, probably you're going to stay up a lot. If you try to aim at happiness, probably you're not going to be so happy, though it's not the worst thing. It's not quite like sleep, but so much like being grateful can make you feel happy. And if you're being grateful in order to feel happy, it's probably not going to work so well. It has to be genuine gratitude.
Yeah.
And well-being is a better term. Also, happiness connotes, I think, in English at least, there may be, you know, French and Italian terms that are a bit better. Something a little more superficial and the well-being. You can be, you know, not dancing, but it can be a kind of sense of inner peace or calm or something.
Yeah, it's a wider term in a way. It embraces more personalities than those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, for government to be thinking that happiness is its project, maybe isn't quite right. But for a government to be thinking the well-being is a large part of what it's focusing on, that's a pretty good idea.
So what are the things that governments have been doing the last few years that you're most excited about?
Well, in the United States, the country I know best, there have been numerous things that are designed to help people get things that are ingredients of well-being. So one for children might be healthy food. So we've had policies in the United States, and these are behaviorally informed, where if the locality knows that the kid is eligible for the food, the person's automatically in. The parents don't have to sign him up. And it's a really small thing, just switches the default, but it has contributed to a situation in which 12 million children, that's a pretty big number, are getting food to which they are entitled. So that's a big contribution. In terms of environmental protection and saving money, the United States has had both better labels for energy efficiency and for fuel economy, so that instead of seeing this miles per gallon number, whose meaning is extremely unclear, they see annual fuel cost, or you will save this much money over 5 years. And that just informational disclosure is helping people to make sounder choices. This is accompanied by regulations which are more aggressive than information, but they leave freedom of choice. That is, ensuring that the fleet is going to get more fuel efficient. And while people aren't marching under a banner of fuel efficiency now, the effect of greater fuel efficiency is to put more money in people's pockets, which is especially good for people who are struggling, to make people healthier because the environment's cleaner. That means the air quality is better, which reduces premature mortality as well as morbidity. It helps combat climate change because greenhouse gas emissions are lower. And it produces greater energy independence for our democracy. So that seems really good. For credit cards, one thing I'm very excited about is kind of in connection with the Great Recession, there's been an effort to help consumers manage their finances better. And part of that is credit card law, where the companies have to tell people about what's going to happen if they pay their bills late, or if they don't pay them, or if they go over. And that little disclosure, which is on credit card bills, has been a part of a set of reforms from 2009, which are giving consumers $12 billion more annually than they had before. A very rigorous study. And the concentration of the savings are in the hands of people without good credit ratings. And those are people who don't have a ton of money. So these are reforms which, you know, they're not...
They're tiny tweaks, and yet they can have huge effects
on
people's lives.
All of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And the toolkit that that we seem to reach for time and again when it comes to public policy and using behavioural science. It's all about making it easier for the automatic systems in people's brains to comprehend what the right choices are and all the best choices are. And so the techniques that we tend to reach for are simplifying messages and clarifying messages, making them very personal, making them perhaps social, because that's also something we're automatically drawn to. That toolkit is great. Is there anything that we tend to miss, do you think, by focusing so much on those dimensions?
I think there are a couple things. There are two kind of sleeper pieces of the toolkit, which I think we're going to see a lot more of in the next 10 years. One is reminders.
Yeah.
So often, if the question is how to get people to make a doctor's appointment, or how to get kids to do stuff which will prepare them for college, or to get employees to engage in some activity which is in the company's interest, a little text reminder can make a huge difference. And I think that one has been neglected.
Yeah.
And the reason it's interesting as well as practical is that, as your work frequently emphasizes, attention is kind of the foundation of all of the behavioral stuff, and a reminder responds to the fact that attention is often focused elsewhere. The other that I think is a sleeper that we haven't focused on enough is active choosing.
Right.
Just to say to people, are you going to vote in the next election? Increases voting. Yeah. To ask a large audience of people how many of you are going to buy an automobile in the next year, that is actually a favor to the automobile industry, yeah, because it increases purchases. Yeah. So to get people actively make choices, I think that's one that we need to give more attention to.
Yeah, I think that's a very exciting development, because if I think about my own work, I do think about the two-system brain. I do think about the interplay between the deliberate system and the automatic system in people's brains. I do think, as you say, about the fact we've got limited stock of attention. How do we husband that limited stock of attention more effectively? How do we recognize the limitations of our brain? But there's a whole other set of fantastic behavioral science out there, which is about how the brain responds to threats and rewards. And one of the most profoundly rewarding things for the human being in general is autonomy. The sense of feeling in control and the sense of having autonomy over choices that you're making in your life. So active choosing is quite exciting in the sense that it says, yes, it really is useful to make it super simple for people. And it's also often quite powerful to allow people a sense that they're making the choice for themselves.
Yes, so you could default people into certain outcomes, whether it's a savings plan or an energy provider, yeah, or an anti-smoking program that would be in their interests. And doctors often are pretty good at saying, kind of by default, this is what we're going to do. Yeah. But if it's an area where people's own identification with the steps is really important to making the steps work, right, matters, then you want active choosing instead. Right. So there's a fantastic study that supports what you said involving smoking, actually, where people are told if you go into a smoking program and succeed in quitting, you will get a bonus at the end of the year. People really like that program. They go in very large numbers. There's another where people are told there's a smoking program where if you go in, you will lose money at the end of the year if you don't cease smoking. Yeah. And they don't go in that much because they perceive it as a threat rather than an opportunity to earn something. Yeah.
That's interesting. And I remember another study actually on smoking cessation as well, which looked at whether the doctor's behaviour was what they coded as autonomy supportive. Are you giving the patient choices, informed choices, of course? And what they found was that people had much higher chance of actually stopping smoking if they were working with a doctor who gave them a sense of control in the process. even without the kind of mechanisms you're talking about.
No, and you know, the two-system brain that you referred to, it has a really interesting relationship to what we're now talking about, because you could say there's the automatic system of the brain, and there are reforms that can be undertaken by companies or doctors or governments that let the automatic system kind of just go about its business, like the default rule to which I referred, or for kids, they're just automatically in the system.
Yeah.
But for active choosing, often what we're doing is we're giving a little signal to system 2. Like a reminder, and giving system 2 its moment.
System 2 being the deliberate system, the reflective system.
Exactly,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then the deliberative system feels in charge, and you know, the automatic and deliberative, there can be some interaction between the two,
yeah.
and if people feel, you know, deliberatively that this is I'm identified with this course of action,
Yeah.
then they can get on a path that's often something they are long-term committed to.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you did some work recently on green energy choices, and the fact that when the default was to choose a green energy option, that it could provoke almost a sense of resentment, I remember you writing, but that if people had a sense that they were making a choice that was in line with their values, that it was much more likely to be something they'd stick with or go for.
This is a result that, you know, I was really surprised by, because the general view is that if you enroll people automatically in something, you'll get a big uptick in their participation rates. If you ask them whether they want to choose, then you'll get an uptick. Not as big as automatic enrollment. And if you ask them if they want to participate, where the default is they're not, then that's the loser of the 3.
Right.
But for green energy, the first 2, the hierarchy of the first 2, as you said, it's flipped.
Yeah.
That if people are automatically enrolled in green energy, a non-trivial number will say, "You're doing that to me?"
Yeah.
It's costing well. Yeah.
Yes.
And so the default, it is effective, but not as effective as anticipated. If people ask, do you want to be in green energy under circumstances where they're making an active choice, they don't feel upset, and their moral convictions kick in. Not everyone, of course, but enough so that that's a really effective environmental strategy.
And it's interesting because that then takes us, you know, much closer to the environments that I work in workplaces, in businesses, where typically as a boss, you can't just tell people what to do. Well, you can, but the limits of that, you hit up against them pretty quickly, because if the context changes, the person doesn't, you know, have a sense of what they should do, and they're not as motivated because they don't have that sense of autonomy. So I'm often working with leaders and managers to help them understand how to promote an environment of active choosing, if you like. How is it that they can create a sense of ownership of a piece of work by the people that work for them, even if they're delegating the work to them. And you know, that's why I find myself so often teaching people how to be coaches, because a good coach doesn't tell you what to do. A good coach asks the right questions to elicit your own thinking.
That's great.
It's
the best coach in sports, I think, in the history of sports coaching is a boxing trainer named Angelo Dundee, who trained Muhammad Ali, the greatest boxer in history and the most egotistical boxer in history. And Angelo Dundee was asked, how did you train the best and the most egotistical guy? How did you tell him what to do? Yeah. And he said, here was my strategy. If Ali wasn't throwing a left hook in practice, and he kind of needed to throw a left hook, I'd say to him, not throw the left hook. I'd say to him, Muhammad, your left hook is tremendous today. I love how you're throwing the left hook. Just keep doing what you're doing. That left hook, whoa. And then he'd start throwing the left hook.
Fantastic. Then he owns the choice.
Yeah,
he's very happy
completely.
with it, yeah.
And he felt it was his choice then,
Yeah.
and not. And I have to confess that in teaching and as a colleague, and sometimes in government, I didn't not use that strategy.
You didn't not use that. Yeah, and actually that's another technique that I often teach, which is when you're giving feedback to someone, we often forget to give feedback on the things that are fantastic, that people should do more of. Sometimes they're really small, and sometimes they're a small part of the whole of what you feel this person needs to do differently. But actually starting by saying, you're really great at that. You're really great at the left hook. What I like about it is this: if when you do it, it's fantastic because of these reasons. Then you're engaging with people's brains in a very different way. You're creating a very rewarding environment.
This is in your book, and it's fantastic. And if you start out with something that is positive, it does a bunch of things at once, I think. First, it gives them something to focus on and to continue with, rather than to be demoralized. Second, it makes them more receptive to critical stuff. And third, it establishes a relationship, which just is one of constructive improvement, rather than you're being acted on by this person who knows better than you do.
Yeah. So I wonder, I think in the business environment, and I use business broadly, I mean I include sort of public sector organizations as well. When you're working with people to help them be at their best and thinking about how to apply behavioral science, the toolkit that's available to you is very broad, actually. It's not just about how do you nudge a customer into choosing this product over this product. There's such a lot of great science on how to help people be at their best. Especially, this idea of how do you create a more rewarding environment that helps people's brains not be on the defensive. I don't see so much of that side of behavioral science in public policy yet.
Well, let's think about that a little bit. So if you look at the US and the UK, they are using defaults.
Yes.
So it's not a matter of starting with an upbeat assessment of people, but it's making the preferred path the easy path. Yeah. So that's done. Yeah. If you look at your earlier point about making things social, the UK recently, in order to reduce excessive antibiotic prescription, informed people, that is doctors who were the excessive antibiotic prescribers, that they were in a small group of people who were big-time prescribers, and that eliminated over 70,000 antibiotic prescriptions in a 6-month period. Yeah. So that works. Yeah. In the United States, there's an effort to encourage people in the military to enroll in savings programs, which involve just what we're talking about, active choosing at a time when they enter onto the base, and that produced a significant uptick. Yeah. So there are some strategies that are maybe more psychologically particular, the sort we're now discussing, like the Angelo Dundee strategy. It's hard to think how government's going to, tell its citizens, be a little hokey to give them some general compliment and not real.
You're amazing.
You're amazing. Now,
please vote.
Please vote. Maybe some politicians do something like that. But the other things in the toolbox we are observing. And one thing that I think is extremely interesting and potentially quite controversial is an understanding of behavioral, let's say, biases from the automatic system as a basis not only for the choice-preserving approaches we're discussing, but sometimes more intrusive approaches like energy efficiency requirements, which the U.S. government has defended partly on the ground that, when consumers are buying a refrigerator, the automatic part of the brain is thinking two things: how much does it cost, and how does it look?
Yes.
And maybe they're thinking also, does it make things cold?
Yes.
They're not
does it fit in my kitchen?
Yeah, that's really important.
Yeah.
So those are 4 things. But thinking, how much is it going to cost annually to operate compared to another refrigerator?
That's a complex calculation that's challenging for the average brain.
Yeah.
Right?
And we were discussing some tools about how to make the average brain able to handle that better, like over a 10-year period it'll cost this. But even that may be the 6th question you ask, when it should be, one of the top 4. Yeah. And that might lead to justified more regulatory requirements than we'd otherwise want to see. Yeah,
I don't think that governments should say, you're amazing, now here's the thing I want you to do. But I do think there's something interesting about the power of positive framing of messages, especially given that in the past we've tended to focus on the existence of loss aversion, that if you tell someone that they're going to lose something, that they're going to suffer, that's a very motivating thing to get people to act. But I think there is a category of decisions where painting a positive picture is actually quite helpful, because it creates a motivation that's, I want to go towards that and I want to stay there, rather than a sort of very simple, basic, oh, well, I must avoid that.
You're quite right. And both for government and for businesses, I think we need more thinking and research on this, because the view that's kind of standard is, if you tell people you're going to lose X if you don't do something, then they get activated.
Yeah.
But not only is it a little dispiriting to focus on that, it can be unsuccessful,
right,
because people might think, to heck with you.
Yes,
Or,
and they might step away from the whole arena because it just makes you feel bad.
and there's data suggesting that loss aversion, though it focuses the mind, it can also quickly produce a counter-reaction of, I don't believe you, or I'm going to think about something else.
Yeah.
And so there's recent work, including some work from neuroscientists, which is consistent with what you say, where a gain frame actually can be more effective because it doesn't produce the counter-reaction. It's also more hedonically, it's better to hear, you can gain this than if you don't do that.
Right.
Oh
I mean,
my God.
you were one of the first people to publicize the gain versus loss frame. I remember reading way back. Actually, way back, your book was published, that Nudge was published in 2008. Of course, you'd been writing for decades and decades on many other topics.
Yeah, since 1902.
Right.
First one was 1901, I think.
But I remember in Nudge that you talked about that very basic finding that when you frame surgery as 90% of people survive, people are more drawn to it than 10% die.
Yes, which supports your point. So if the 90% live frame, that's the gain frame,
Yeah.
and for a physician who really thinks the thing is indicated, meaning it's the wise thing to do, if the goal is to get the patient on board, the 96% survive frame is the right one, even though it's not more accurate than the 10% don't. Now, of course, the more neutral frame is to say 90% survive, 10% don't.
Yeah.
And that probably will produce less enthusiasm than 90% survive, period. But the neutral frame at least has the advantage of A, being accurate, and B, getting people's attention to the fact the likelihood it's going to be okay is overwhelmingly high.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you take this advice yourself in the way you run your own life and make your own choices?
I try. And
can you give me an example?
Well, I try in sports, where if I or my team or someone I care about, like my son, doesn't do well, I try to think of some way of putting it in a context that makes it a more positive experience. Now, to do this in a way that gets at the automatic system of the brain accurately is challenging, but there are ways of thinking about it that make it better. Another way that is, I think, more successful in the context of challenging parts of life is just to put your attention elsewhere.
Right.
And that's the thing to do. So Danny Kahneman, the great psychologist, I think the best sentence he ever wrote, and he's written a lot of sentences, nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you're thinking about it. Which you should not use that when you're thinking about something really great. But if it's something that's tough, like a setback in life or a challenge that you haven't been able to meet, it's a very good thing to think.
Yeah. Well, back to your comment earlier on about attention being the currency that we have to bring to life. It's fascinating the way that whatever is top of mind for us will determine what it is that we consciously perceive, given that our brains have limited capacity to process reality at any given time.
A very homely example that actually was motivated partly by your book was I was in a terrible rainstorm just the other day, and I had about a 2-mile walk to make, and it would be natural to think it's rainy, the pants are getting wet, it's miserable, but that isn't determined by the situation.
Yeah.
So I found myself singing loudly enough so that it was real singing, but not so loudly that anyone else could hear. Please God. I found myself singing in the rain, and that at least 1.5 miles of that 2-mile walk was absurdly joyful. And that I try to do that sort of thing in general, where if there's something that is not so good, to treat its not so goodness as a product of the mind rather than the fact. That's eminently doable.
Absurdly joyful. Well, that's a great goal for all of us. And the truth is that behavioural science can, strangely enough, help us in that direction. And you've done so much to help us all understand that. So thank you very much, Cass Sunstein. I'm Caroline Webb, author of How to Have a Good Day, drawing very heavily on Cass's work over the years. And thank you very much for being here.
Oh, thanks to you.